All right, welcome everybody. John Laster here with the Manual Save podcast. I feel like the theme's doing pretty well if Alex, your head's bobbing while it's going off and you hear it for the first time.
Yeah.
So thanks
Got a
again
very,
to Guille
very
from
Mega Man thing.
Chromatic for that.
Yeah.
Joined by Justin Connors from 8 Prime Esports.
Hello.
As well as Alex Esten, who you are an indie game board dev and you have put out your first game this year, right?
Yes. Yeah. Still kind of in utter shock and disbelief about the whole thing, quite frankly. Yeah.
Yeah. So you released the Black Brick. Is that available for purchase still, or are you waiting for another batch?
We're waiting for another batch.
Okay.
This has been, the Kickstarter Deluxe Edition so far that we're rolling out, and we're trying to gauge if there's additional interest to do basically a second printing, I suppose. So far, a lot of really good feedback. We've got an FAQ post on our Facebook page that kind of ballooned up considerably. Bunch of hardcore gaming nerds all like, hey, well, if we play this ability at this point, what does it do? And the one guy's like, oh my god, I'm so sorry, thank you for putting up with me, da da da. And I'm like, hey, I'm talking game theory with a bunch of nerds. I'm happy. So yeah.
That's great.
No, that's awesome. So I'm gonna rewind a bit and just be like, what made you want to get into creating board games?
That's a good question. I think I always kind of had an interest in it. Even back in high school when the Earth was still cooling, there was a dream I had to do a Monty Python the Holy Grail, RPG, in the vein of like a Final Fantasy III Super Nintendo 16-bit kind of thing. And it was only like a single page, and I actually had kind of designed out most of the game. I knew what the summons would be, what the spells would be. Sir not appearing in this film would become Sir not appearing in this game, which did make his way into the Black Brick because, it stuck with me over the years. And then, life happened. And probably only in the past 5 to 6 years did I get back into board gaming. I used to be really big into it, Hero Quest, a lot of Scrabble. HeroClix was another big one. I loved the board on it. It was always really, really interesting. And I guess I really would blame Dave Voiles and my buddy Mike, because they got me back into board game and tabletop game in a really big way. And then from there, just kind of naturally evolved out to where I was messing around with a Lego D&D, I guess homebrew, essentially. And then that kind of steadily mutated into its own little proprietary combat engine. And my same friend Mike had asked me, about 5 months into it, he's like, so you're not really doing D&D, you're basically creating your own game then. And that kind of got me to realize, okay, yeah, this is a bigger project than I thought it might have ever been. And that was 2 years ago at this point. So yeah.
That's an interesting thing too, because again, there's obviously a lot of history even in video games of games starting as a mod for something and then becoming a whole much bigger thing.
Counter-Strike.
Yeah. So what I find is crazy too is that having to again notice how a lot of games kind of have some of the same mechanics, and like we talked about yesterday, kind of noticing, okay, how can I make that mechanic seem different or fun for my game? And that's what I think is very interesting about board games and how they accomplish that. Yeah,
absolutely. It was interesting because very early on in the development of Black Brick, the whole way through, from the very start of the entire project, we had the ability cards, basically spells and skills you could play out of your hand, whatever. And we were always very careful not to say tap in any capacity whatsoever, because Wizard of the Coast has trademark, patent, whatever on it. But like a card rotation mechanic has always been very interesting to me. And we use card rotation as a cooldown mechanism. And actually, I came across this one developer creating a zombie survival one-on-one game, again, using the same kind of card rotation mechanic. And, it was, to your point, like it's always really cool to see, how games and developers kind of use similar or shared, mechanics, but then they incorporate them either a little differently or the purpose behind them is a little bit different, and it's very cool. It's a very neat spot to be in.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the coolest things that is kind of resonated, at least going on right now with everything going on with the global pandemic,
Yeah.
is just how much I miss being able to sit at the same table and play a game like that.
Yeah.
It's just definitely been a lot more difficult right now. And I mean, for yourself, that's got to have been a unique pain point you weren't expecting when you decided to do this. Not only from the supply chain constraints of like finding the parts, but also just from, are people going to want to play board games right now? Are people going to be able to get 6 or whatever friends together to play a game? Because I know for me, that's always been the biggest hindrance, is just, can I find people who are willing to dive into this crazy game that's got like 7 pages of rules that you slightly need a law degree to understand, and then like they're all just like, oh, let's play Monopoly or something. I'm like, no, there's better games, man.
Oh,
there's better games.
Yeah. Monopoly reminds me of the one line from War Games. The only winning move is to not play. That's like I feel like there's a good game in Monopoly. It's just how the rules are actually structured. It just doesn't. I want more like actual cutthroat capitalism. I want it to be a statement on capitalist structure rather than like embracing, the capitalist tendencies. But yeah, I mean, going into this year, the last main like public demo that I had for the game was in MagFest down in Maryland, I think, outside DC, something like that. My friends were with me there, and my one friend was like pimping me out the whole time. If a bunch of like new friends came into the hotel room or whatever, she would like kind of sidle up to them like, hey, check this game out, and then basically put me on the spot to do a quick pitch, right there, in the hotel. And that was, early January. So, we basically got back from MagFest. I knew that the Kickstarter was going to be happening, in March. And then, but the month and a half later, the entire scope of society just completely fell apart. And, that was pretty terrifying, going into the Kickstarter and realizing, we're trying to launch a physical tabletop game in the middle of a pandemic. It's I think it's either dumb luck that it succeeded, or I guess maybe launching a Kickstarter for a board game in the middle of a global pandemic was maybe one of the better decisions I made in my life, because
for sure,
people, they were stuck at home, and they still are, and they need, really fun, new toys to play with. And the black brick, I guess, was one that people decided, what, that is a toy that I need right now. And it still blows my mind that this project actually succeeded when, even in good times, only 33% roughly of any Kickstarter campaign actually, succeeds. And so the fact that we beat that percentage, and then we did it in the middle of a global pandemic, just blows my mind.
So I want to talk a little about, because you got into board gaming. Obviously, the challenge there that you don't have with, like, say, traditional video game, but I say traditional even though, but video games, is that you have to not only create the rules, but you have to create enough of the world so that the people can enjoy the game. And that's obviously something that you can't really be taught. So how did you get in? Like, how did you start learning that and adapting that? Like, was that, like, talk about your challenges with that side of it.
So, without a doubt, I think the biggest challenge, I mean, I've always been a writer. I've always been very creative in that regard. And so I tended to always do like a lot of short stories, short form writing, skits, whatever. And so I kind of already had a decent handle on the world aspect of it, the characters, the world building, storytelling. But the art was really going to be the big, sticking point. And up until, I would say, summer of 2019, I had no idea what the art was actually going to be. And then I was fortunate enough, luckily, to connect with a coworker's husband, who is an amazing graphic designer. He knew exactly what I wanted and what I was feeling and everything. He just cranked it out, and it was absolutely gorgeous. Like everything you see in the Black Brick is basically him, and the art was always definitely the biggest sticking point for me. I did a lot of Illustrator in college. And then thankfully, I've been able to kind of knock the rust off of those skills at this point, so I'm able to jump in where needed. But art aside, the world building aspect to it, the characters, the sense of humor, that's basically who I've been for 15, 20 years that I've been doing actual, creative writing. And like I said, Sir not appearing in this game, I had to include him as a special character because he's been with me since high school basically. So yeah,
that's awesome.
No, it's super cool. Just along this whole process, what kind of stuff surprised you the most? What were you not expecting to kind of change that ended up changing?
Honestly, I think the fan reaction. I think that's really what completely blew my mind. Because, for me, it's been this goofy little hobbyist kind of thing that I've been working on for almost 3 years, and I don't know if, I guess for any creator really, you never really know that you've got something good, until other people kind of help you validate, the direction. And so, even when friends and family and playtesters all were messing around with the very first prototype, where it's like hand drawn, handwritten poker-sized cards, and index cards for character sheets, basically. Even there, I had absolutely no idea that people would actually, dig, what the game was. But being able to find the audience, that was absolutely the biggest surprise that threw me for a loop. I was kind of an emotional wreck for a solid couple of months after realizing that, oh my God, it funded. My wife will attest to that. And so, yeah.
So I want to jump back to the Kickstarter in a second,
Yeah.
but I feel like we haven't really explained what the Black Brick is yet.
Yeah.
So for any viewers who are not familiar with the game, can you give us the quick pitch on it?
Sure. Tabletop dungeon crawler, 1 to 12 players. The Black Brick title itself comes from 2 different things. One is the MacGuffin throughout the story. The king has tasked you with a quest to retrieve this chunk of obsidian from within a haunted castle. Very Diablo-esque, going down through multiple levels, randomized encounters, stuff like that. And then the other part of the title came from the original way that we kind of prototyped and play tested, certain parts of the game using Lego minifigs. And so, Lego has been a big part of my life, and I had a bunch of them laying around my house. So I figured, why spend money on any kind of, action figure or anything when I've got bins of Lego toys that I can just really quickly iterate on concepts and movement and everything. Originally, the game did have a grid-based combat movement and positioning system, but then it turned into a pure card game, which was one of the best decisions that we made for it, because the whole thing fits into a 3x4 by 8-inch box, and yeah, it's yeah.
It's interesting when you have, like I said, the things that weren't a part of the gameplay that still some sort of inspire the game itself. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because after we shifted to a pure card version of it, so you've got your table and you've got your cards all in order, on the battlefield, your enemy's row and your row, whatever. There's still technically the movement and positioning system in the game. We just don't bother players with it. And so it worked out. It definitely worked out.
No, that's fantastic. And I know you've talked about it a little bit so far, but you did put this through Kickstarter successfully. And I
Yeah.
know one of the most common questions I get asked in general is how the heck do I fund my game? One of the most obvious routes, at least since it started, has always been Kickstarter.
Mhm.
However, we're in like a new era of Kickstarter compared to, I feel like, the heyday back in, I don't even know, what was it, like 2015, 16 or something.
Yeah.
You know, back when like the big, $3 million games were getting funded, and
Yeah.
it hasn't been as typical for that anymore.
Yeah.
What was that process like, and what do you think made you successful there?
So two things. One, community. Um, starting the advertising marketing early, getting the awareness of this project out into the world. But the other half of it is just research. I've always been a big data nerd. I've crashed Excel on more than one occasion. And so going into the Kickstarter planning process, I kind of already knew what my target funding goal would be. I knew what targets to avoid, what pledge levels to avoid. Because basically there's a statistic where the closer a target gets to the $6,500 level, pledge target, success rates start dropping off precipitously. Um, you do have games that'll buck that trend completely, and that's awesome. But generally, that's kind of how it happens. The further, especially you get over 10K target, the harder it's going to be to hit your goal. And so going into it, I kind of knew what I wanted to do, where I needed to be. I do think that the Black Brick probably overperformed a little bit, even though within the genre that it was, a $70 pledge level for a deluxe edition of the game with free shipping for the continental US, it's entirely within that sweet spot. But yeah, I mean, it just knowing the community, and knowing the numbers that I needed to hit going into it. You know, research was key. Yeah.
So how long was the process between game ideation to okay, we're ready for a Kickstarter?
I mean, technically, I would say about a year and a half. Because in that time, that was when we did a proper card version of the prototype, where it actually fit into a box even smaller, basically, than the one we did with the Kickstarter itself. Once we had the card version kind of down, and we knew that was the direction that we wanted to take, that was about a year and a half, I think, until the actual Kickstarter happened. I mean, given that the first time we publicly debuted the game at PAX Unplugged in Philly back in December of 2019, that was the first public debut, of the game, and we were targeting in March, 2020, Kickstarter launch. So it was a whirlwind of a year and a half, to be sure.
Were you hitting? Did you have give yourself traditional milestones, or were you just grinding to okay, this part's done, okay, this part's done? Then you're finally like, we're not getting anywhere. We got to just start putting this thing out there.
A little bit, yeah. Going into summer 2019, the art was the last real piece that we needed to figure out. Other than that, the classes were intact. We were still tweaking skills and abilities and balancing a little tiny bit, but the core 98% of the game structure itself was intact. I'd say from September 2019 till November, that was the final crunch, I guess. And that's when the art completely came together. And when we were approaching PAX Unplugged, we were like, all right, screw it, now's the time, and the demo copy that I brought to PAX Unplugged, it had issues, to be sure. It had a couple of issues, but they were easy fixes. They weren't anything hardcore structural, with the game. And the nice thing is, with it being a physical game, it's going to be tougher to rebalance, anything. But I've played so many MMOs in the day that anytime there's a gigantic nerf happening for any particular class or skill synergy, I always kind of get disappointed, because I like games that are flexible enough to let you break them, and that's kind of where I see the Black Brick, where it's kind of modeled after a little bit of Diablo, a little bit of the first Guild Wars, and I like games with a lot of really cool class synergies, and that's kind of what we baked into to the Black Brick. And so I am as unbalanced, I think, as it could potentially be, because I'm sure that players out there are going to devise some insane strategies and tactics that are just going to crack entire monsters wide open. But that's kind of the cool thing, like that's what I would expect out of this genre and these players themselves. And so, sorry, just a lot on my mind.
I think you touched on something that's always been super cool to me, and that's just like kind of that kind of game balance aspect of it, because you could adjust different stats up or down and be like, okay, this area is too hard because people apparently can't beat it.
Yeah.
But the reality is, if you give people enough time, they're going to come up with some way of cheesing through a strategy.
Yeah.
That's just almost a fact. And the cool thing about a board game in particular is it's really easy to implement house rules.
Yeah.
So even if you don't personally nerf something, if me and my friends have been playing this game for a while and we love it, but we're like, there's this one aspect of it that's just busted. It's really easy to just be like, all right, you can't do that. And players can kind of adjust the balance in that way on their own, because it can kind of have this kind of like living, breathing, thing that once you put it into the wild, it just grows on its own in a completely different way.
Yeah, and it's funny you should mention that, because being the data nerd and enjoying Excel, as much as I am and do, I actually had scripted out a damage calculator in Excel so that if I tweaked any character attribute at all during the entire development process, I could immediately see what impact that's going to have in a standard battle, round 1, 2, 3, and 4. And, it's how we calculated, what minion health was going to be, what captain health would be, boss fights. And so, on average, even prior to like anybody really playing any version of the game, we already knew that a minion could die in 3 solid hits, 3 rolls of the dice. And just the fact that the majority of the game was kind of designed and built in Excel before anything is just it's a very me kind of thing to do. It's just ridiculous.
Well, obviously a lot of games like this, and any game in general, usually you can do only so much. The giving it out to real people and the play testing is a huge factor. So how did you approach the play test? How did you know what information to listen to versus just people complaining? How did you run through a play test?
So that's a really good question. So one of the biggest play test bits of feedback that we had was at Philly Game Shop on South Street. Brought the game there, we demoed it, and that was the version of the game where our main bosses had a bit too much defense, and the Sorrow, the Ranger Commander, the big boss, kind of ruined everybody's day for this initial fight. Like a fool, I thought, okay, this is gonna be fine. We'll just shuffle all the exploration cards, and whatever we draw, we draw. Yeah, that didn't really work out so well for a level 1 fight with completely new people to the game. And so we drew the Sorrow and like 2 mini bosses. And by the end of the first demo, the first play test, I I was kind of worried that people were just gonna like get up and walk away. Because it was a train wreck in slow motion, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. So I just had to kind of sit there and just walk people through it as best I could. But even when the sorrow kept messing up everybody, they still wanted to kill him, and that's what kind of led to them, wanting to at least finish this one demo, and then we started another one with proper, low-level characters. But like in terms of the feedback that I would receive, I think I was able to somewhat early on figure out what feedback to use and take, and then what was just like window dressing framework that really ultimately wouldn't matter. Anytime anybody had said, oh well, this feels way too difficult. I feel like I'm not doing enough damage, or I feel like I'm taking too much damage. Anything that really got to the core gameplay balance between the different classes and skills. Anything that basically would have affected the damage calculator in Excel. That was the stuff that I really paid attention to, because, that and the play between the ability cards, that is the core of the game. And thankfully, I mean, most of the feedback that we got was absolutely based on the core gameplay loop.
Lucky you.
Yeah. And I think, I guess part of that, people played the index card version of the game, and so they weren't even focused on, oh, well, this doesn't look great, because my handwriting kind of sucks sometimes. And so, and even with the full demo versions, I passed one of the demo versions to to Friday Night Games, based up in Ontario, because one of their guys came down for PAX Unplugged, and they sent me a very nice long email of their feedback, and a lot of it was spot on. I mean, a lot of it was either stuff that I was already planning on fixing anyway, and then other things. John, I don't know if you went through the cards in the game yet, but so the Selfless Heroic Act card in there was actually based on feedback from Friday Night Games, and the logo on that card is actually their logo. I retrofitted it for the Black Brick, and so like they're super psyched because they're in the game, so it was really cool. Really cool, yeah. And like all their feedback was absolutely perfect. It all struck to game balance. And I mean, it was fantastic, awesome.
So since you have this huge damage calculator and you kind of did all this theory crafting and math behind the scenes, was there anything you expected to be stronger than it actually has been, at least based on player feedback? Was there some kind of strategy you thought people would do that they haven't done yet? I know it's a little harder because you don't get to see every single play test like you would theoretically in a video game. You don't get that data back all the time. But I know you've done a lot of these play tests and gotten to watch them. Yeah.
So actually, one of the backer games that actually joined earlier this week, they were using a strategy actually that I had not really considered, where they were spreading damage out. And I realized that in and of itself is a decent offensive strategy, because you can put way more pressure on the healers. But at the same time, you're not focusing fire, and so your battle's going to take longer, and so therefore you're also going to take more damage. I see spreading out damage to be a pretty decent like PvP strategy for sure. But in all the calculations and all the predictive analytics and everything, I was always operating under the assumption that people would always try to focus fire and take down a weakened enemy rather than trying to wound a healthy enemy. I mean, one reason why I love Advance Wars is because the damage you deal to an enemy is going to directly impact the damage that it can put out. So essentially, you cripple and move on. If you can drop a tank down to like 3 HP from 10, they're not going to deal anywhere near as much damage to any of your units. Man, now I want to do strategy RPG like Advanced Wars in a tabletop game. I don't know how that's going to work, but I got to figure it out.
Started here,
right? Yeah. But like so that backer game that I kind of sat in for, it was interesting seeing the damage spread strategy for sure. Yeah, it's been interesting, like just seeing what classes especially people have seemed to gravitate toward. A lot of people seem to really love the dual class characters. Sir Not Appearing in this game is a favorite among a bunch of my Monty Python friends out in the world. And it's cool. It's very cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I know we were talking about Kickstarter a little bit earlier, but I think one of the nicest parts about Kickstarter as a board game is the fact that you'd already spent a year and a half on this project by the time you even put it up there.
Yeah.
And there was maybe 3 months left, 3 to 6. And honestly, part of why it was as long as it was likely the pandemic more than anything. But you were still able to kind of ship right along your expectations. And I know for me, I've always been hesitant to back stuff on there that isn't as like de-risked. You know what I mean? Like to me, a board game is pretty simple when it comes to if you have it at a prototype stage, maybe you're paying a little extra for art. Maybe you're just kind of pre-producing it. You're getting the copies, but you're not necessarily having to go through and add $50,000 worth of code, And that's what's always made me a little nervous when it comes to video games on Kickstarter. I've never been a huge Kickstarter backer myself, even though, like, obviously I've engaged with plenty of products once they've been off it.
Yeah. I would love to eventually, get into the digital game space. A couple of Holy Grail projects I would love to do. Gummy Bears 2D platformer. Disney, if you're listening, I've got some ideas. I would love to talk to you. Your DuckTales reboot is brilliant, and it needs to be made into DuckTales 3. I've got ideas. Just saying. But yeah, I mean, for the digital space, there's a Bloodstain, like Curse of the Moon or something. Apparently, the very first, version 1 point whatever, had some technical issues from what I've heard. Eventually, they patched everything, but from a Kickstarter perspective, it's always a concern. We all have heard horror stories about backers waiting 2, 3, 4 years for anything that they've ever backed. I consider myself and my company to be very lucky that we had set a September 2020 delivery target, and we were still able to hit that even with a global pandemic and our manufacturer based in the US having to shut down for like a month and a half because they had a shelter in place order, I think. I mean, the fact that we were able to still hit our September delivery target was just amazing. One thing that I think I learned from doing the research is people, I guess, can really tell when you spent a good chunk of time on the development and design process prior to even announcing anything. I've seen some Kickstarter projects where they're basically working on the game for like 6 months, and then they decide, look, we're going to do it, right here, right now. And that would always make me feel very uncomfortable, because I guess it's tough for me to really figure out, if I were a backer, especially, and I saw something that had only been in the works for 6 months, that would potentially concern me because at that point I would start asking questions about the balance, the overall design, the scope. From an IT background, feature creep is always a problem anyway, and for game design and development, feature creep especially is a massive challenge. And I guess, from PAX Unplugged to MagFest and then to the Kickstarter launch, the fact that all of it happened within 4 months, maybe, I think was good timing. we hit the public with the game, and then we basically didn't let them forget about it. I wouldn't have like announced and unveiled the game and then waited an entire year, for example, to officially do the Kickstarter. So we had momentum going into it, and yeah.
I think that's the thing too that a lot of people make a mistake for Kickstarters. A lot of people will tend to have an idea, I got an thing, and then they just drop it. And like you said, they don't really ramp up to the fact that they're going to do a Kickstarter. They kind of just drop the Kickstarter and be like, guys, we've got something going. And it's like, if you would have actually built up the hype for dropping the Kickstarter, it'd be a much more successful. But a lot of people don't learn that until after they've unsuccessfully done it.
Yeah. And I think to Gloomhaven's credit, and I think this speaks a lot of what Gloomhaven has done in terms of just awareness. I think a lot of people look at Gloomhaven, and they look at the Kickstarter board game campaigns that raise hundreds of thousands of dollars in a couple of weeks. And I think that tends to, skew perspectives. People think, oh, okay, I'll work on this for 7 months and boom, we'll be good to go. And, Gloomhaven is one of the exceptions for sure, not the rule. And then Frosthaven, when it launched, it cleared millions of dollars in its first 20 minutes. It's just blows my mind. But it's cool that people, I think backers out there, they do recognize when a project has been worked on, and I'm just hoping that our follow-up games will capture people's attention and imagination, like this one has. And so
No, and we'll talk about those follow-ups in a second. But
Oh, yeah.
I want to key on something else you mentioned, which was feature creep.
Yeah.
Along this process, what ended up on the cutting room floor in a sense? Like, what didn't make it in there that you were hoping to stick in there?
Definitely some of the original classes that we had in the design doc. Island Cleric, which used to be the original healer for the game, one of the original healers. Bark Spear, still in the back of my head. Like, I want that ability to be in chapter 2. I definitely wanted multi-round status effects. I wanted poison effects in there as well. Originally, like, player hands were a bit more complicated, not complicated, complex. Additional abilities. I think we had an 8 or 10 card hand limit, and we boiled all that down. The multi-round status effects, I wish that we could have gotten them in this game. They weren't working, how they were. Thankfully, dual class characters, we had those from the very beginning, and then there was a span during the development and play testing where I had to just jettison the entire dual class system, because Barbarius the Mighty completely wrecked a warrior character. In chapter 2, Barbarius is going to evolve for sure. He's going to come out with his original dual class incarnation, warrior barbarian, and just mess with people, I'm sure. But status effects are always a challenge, and I've got ideas on how to actually properly implement them for chapter 2, because I'm dead set on bringing back that multi-round spanning status effect system. To be sure and to be fair, the status effect system that we have in this game is very impactful. If you get a -1 or +1 to anything, that will make a difference. +2, -2, same thing. If there's any +3, -3 that you happen to inflict on a single target, they're either completely dead or they are going to ruin your day. And so, those I think were the big features that I always wanted to do, and just they weren't going to work with what we needed to do for this game. the nice thing is, the game is very expandable. The combat system is very versatile. It can actually, and not to do too much of a spoiler, so we've got this siege mode, like tower defense, basically, that I'm tossing around, where the combat will work almost the same, but the positioning is basically you're still using the character cards, but you're just moving them in one by one until they actually reach your party. And so that's something that we would have tried to include in this one as a game concept or game mode, but it never quite worked right either. So that's on the to-do list as well. So yeah.
Is there anything I'm thinking about? I hate to mention other games or anything, but like I think
No.
about like how we have like D&D Beyond has now gone a little digital. I think about the way like Munchkin has their counter for their app. Was there ever conversations of like how do we lift the game off the board and make has that ever been a thing for you guys or?
Yeah, actually. So I back when we were working on the game at the very beginning, we had this crazy notion that, and it's a good thing that we didn't actually do it this way, because we had this crazy notion that we weren't going to put any descriptions on the ability cards themselves. We were going to just do a companion app.
Oh, wow.
So that way,
Yeah.
Like, well, one, they would have to use the app, which we didn't want to drive app adoption any stretch of the imagination. But the thinking was, if we ever were to able to go completely digital with the game, or not completely digital, but a digital version of it, then if we would ever have to do any skill rebalancing, or when we would have to, then we wouldn't have to force players to buy new cards or print new cards or anything. Yeah, we ditched that idea real fast because we realized, just in terms of sheer practicality, like nobody's going to want to look at an app for basically anything. Yeah.
I feel like the one exception to that is whenever someone can actually create real life Yu-Gi-Oh! Where like instead of just putting down the card, I actually have the dragon pop up. I might be willing to look at an app for that,
I mean,
and AR is starting to get there.
Yeah.
It's not there yet, but it is real dang close.
And it's funny I mentioned the app, and I've never actually. I only use the app for Munchkin as a joke to get like one up over somebody, and then like, look in the rules, it says if I have the app, I get a +1.
Yeah, and damn it, John, like that.
Yeah,
AR. Yeah, damn it, man. All right, I'll have to remember to add some AR notes into the design doc. Now 45 pages because I'm insane.
Well, and I think even just during this call, you've mentioned 3 or 4 different projects that you'd like to do. So what is next for you? Because obviously you've talked about Chapter 2, whether it's a new game or an expansion. I'm not sure if you're sure yet, but you've also got few ideas that have been tumbling around here, as well as the ones we talked about on the pre-show.
Yeah. So the 2 follow-ups, and it's funny because literally just last night I realized I can't decide between these 2 ideas for the follow-up. One is going to be called Star Rats: A Space Adventure for Cats, and the way I'm envisioning it, it's kind of a combination. What would happen if like Mass Effect, FTL, and Oregon Trail got jammed together in a cat-based space exploration card game? There's going to be a really cool like alien AI civilization mechanic going into there that's going to use your own action cards against you. And then the other game, basically for the follow-up, we're going into space. No matter which game we do first, we're going into space, because the other one, the working title right now is like Space Marine Acid Bath, which we're going to change the name because it's going to be tough to do a card game with that name. Thank you, Warhammer. And that one kind of is, it's what, Aliens, like James Cameron's Aliens essentially meets like the original Legend of Zelda. So like those are the 2 that, the follow-ups are, those are going to be the follow-ups. And I realized last night I can't really decide which one I want to do before each other. So I'm like, all right, screw it. I'm just going to do 2 follow-ups at the same time and develop them both in tandem. And, like, it'll occupy another 6 months of my life just figuring out, the board, and then, we'll just go from there. And the design doc, I've got this one really like artsy, esoteric 1v1 game like Wizard's Conquest, where very abstract, like black and white, like 1d4s as your actual like minions essentially, and it's all like area control. That one I'm very intrigued by. That one really still captures my attention. And then there are 43 pages worth of other ones that
It makes me think of like hearing stories about someone like Miyamoto. It's like he picks up gardening and all of a sudden there's Pikmin.
Yeah.
He goes to a lot of different shrines and all of a sudden you get Star Fox.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like people see inspiration in just about anything, and then it starts jogging your mind where you're like, I gotta go this way and this way and this way. And then the reality is figuring out which of these products are likely to be makeable, in a fun way, and then also going to have any kind of commercial appeal, and figure out how to balance all of that with, again, like, do you want to get sucked into another 2-year project, or would you rather have maybe a shorter, smaller, interim project to kind of hold you over for that next big one,
Yeah. And the market appeal question is a big one for me. I think I've lucked out with the Black Brick in terms of, you see somebody walking around PAX Unplugged with an "Ask Me About the Black Brick" poster tied to each side of them kind of thing.
Mhm.
And you're like, I have no idea what that game even is, So, and people ask, they do, like the poster, the whole guerrilla marketing campaign, it totally worked. But that was a tough game to market, like people don't intuitively know what the Black Brick is or even what it means or anything. You put a poster for Star Rats, a space adventure for cats. Boom. People like will intuitively, instinctively know exactly what they're probably getting, with that. And I think it also kind of comes down to, while I don't really profess to be able to really understand what a lot of customers are looking for, I do think there's a lot of value in recognizing that not all games have to so broadly appeal, to everybody. The Black Brick, for as gorgeous as it is, at its core, it is a hardcore, old school dungeon crawler where it's like the Etrian Odyssey, basically. Like if you make one mistake in a mole in Etrian Odyssey, the first one can kill you. A mole, little furry thing. Like who does that? But there are some lighter games that I would love to do. Deathman is Dead, which is inspired by Mystery Men way back in the 90s. And, John, you talk about inspiration, and it comes from random places for sure.
Well, and I think you also touched on something that I've had this discussion with more publishers, I feel like, than I can count. And there's some value to understanding what your brand is, and if your brand is a niche, hardcore, kind of dungeon crawler-esque audience, there's nothing wrong with that,
Yeah.
Aim for that audience, like what really almost ends up hurting a lot of people is when people don't understand what your brand is,
Yeah.
Like I can say a Devolver game, and I think you all know in your head what kind of game that means immediately. The same thing with something like Paradox or Bethesda. Bethesda's always going to be super single player focused. Devolver's always that kind of weird, like, quirkiness of like, I don't even, it's hard to put into terms. It's really just Devolver in a lot of ways, and then you got games like Paradox, which are so systems driven that, you know, like that's a 40 to 100 hour game the moment you touch it, you know?
Yeah.
And like, I feel like the biggest issue is when people can't figure out what it is. And then you get people who are picking it up and they're like, oh, I thought it would be like that other one I liked, you know? So like the cool thing is games are so hit driven. You know, you put out 6 or 7 and one blows up, then the back catalog's going to do better too, you know?
Yeah,
for sure.
And as long as you can continue to build this sustainably, you know, all the more power to you, you know?
Yeah. And it's funny because, you know, the games that I'm really passionate about making, you know, are the ones that I certainly hope, you know, do well. I was talking with Friday Night Games a while back, and they had pointed out, you know, like Black Brick is your baby, sure, but Star Rats, that'll be the one that will potentially completely blow up because cats in space, you know. And, yeah.
No, I'm definitely more. I'm real curious to hear more about Star Rats whenever it's a little more fleshed out.
Oh yeah.
But I really want to thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I know you got to go back to the day job soon, so I'm going to let you go. But for anybody who is interested in finding out more about the Black Brick, how can they do that?
So if you're on Instagram, just search the Black Brick. We got hashtags in there. You'll find our stuff with the recent posts there. Brac Games is our handle on Instagram. Brick Brac Games, you know, whatever. Facebook, you can find us on there. Brac Games. And yeah, I mean, we've been having so much fun on it on Instagram and social media that we haven't really jumped into any other formats yet. We do a Twitter handle, but we don't use it because Instagram is fun, you know. So yeah.
I feel that way sometimes about Twitter right now. Like I popped in, saw the discussions going on today, and literally that Abe Simpson meme where he puts the hat back on and walks out.
Yeah.
That's me with Twitter.
Yep.
I'm closing this off today. I've got a podcast in about 20 minutes. Today is not the day to get sucked into legal drama on video games, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like I'm out. Gotta go get actual
I 300 the whole approach. I just open the door and just put my shield out, and I'm like, all right, let's see what we're gonna do today.
All right. Thank you guys so much. I really do appreciate it. I think we will take a break for the next week, but we should be back with some more shows for you guys back in November.
Awesome.
But thank you all, and later.
Thanks, guys.